Hi everyone, welcome to this first tutorial for ECON 220W. In this tutorial I will go over some preferred competition statements and some things related to monopoly as well. In the first exercise I will go over different claims, different statements, and state whether they are true, false, or uncertain. Let's start. Airline companies often sell more seats than are actually available on a flight. In the occasional event that all passengers do show up, this practice of overbooking naturally means that some people with tickets are bumped to a later flight. What criteria might be used to decide which passengers will get on the flight they booked and which do not? Discuss alternatives and evaluate them from an efficiency point of view. First of all, remember that passengers have a different willingness to pay. All of them have a different willingness to pay for a ticket. Now, if you want the allocation to be Pareto efficient, one way or another, you would need passengers who value the flight the most to take the flight. If it is somebody that doesn't value the flight that much as opposed to somebody else who got bumped to a later flight, then we can always find an improvement where the passenger who got the ticket but doesn't value it that much can resell that ticket to the passenger with a high willingness to pay who got bumped to a later flight. So, to make sure that the allocation is Pareto efficient, we would need passengers the passengers with the highest willingness to pay or the highest valuation for the flight to take the first flight. Possible criteria for excluding confirmed passengers might include personal characteristics, the time of check-in, or random assignment. You could give tickets randomly, or you could give tickets or sell tickets according to some personal characteristics. Could be based on age, marital status, family situation, and so on. Or it could be a first come, first served type of strategy by choosing who gets the flight based on the time of check-in. Of course, neither of these is likely to please the people affected. So to promote efficiency, it would be best if only the airline would dump passengers in order of their lowest willingness to pay, or their lowest disutility from being excluded. That way, the people on the plane are the ones who value the flight the most. The problem here is that there is an asymmetry of information. The airline company does not know the passengers' willingnesses to pay. And it is pretty hard for the firm to learn about these willingnesses to pay, as there is no incentive for passengers to truthfully report their valuation for the flight. So asymmetric information a priori prevents an efficient solution here. Towards the end of the course, we are going to go through asymmetric information again, and we will see why and how it leads to a market failure. Instead of choosing who gets to fly, maybe you could decide who doesn't get to fly. So one way out of this dilemma is to practice of paying people not to take the flight. After all, everybody has a ticket, but there are too many tickets for the capacity of the plane. So what a company could do is, instead of choosing who gets to go on the plane, is to compensate the ones who are not going to go on the plane but that have a ticket. The idea is that the firm can ask how much people are willing to receive in order to give up on their ticket, or in order to give up on the flight. This can help because only those who stay are the ones for whom flying is worth more than the payment offered. The ones who absolutely need or want to fly will refuse the payment, while all the other ones who don't mind and don't value that flight that much might accept to not take this plane for a lower price. And then you can adjust the payment until the right number of people willingly give up their seat, and you get the exact number of passengers who want to take the plane, and that corresponds to the number of seats in the plane. This is some kind of an auction. The company could come to you while you wait for your flight and say, are you giving up on your flight if we offer you this? You could say yes or no. And then you can ask other people until they find the number of, until they find the exact number of people who accept to give up on their flight will be equal to the excess number of tickets. This way, the ones who are going to take the plane are the ones for whom the payment was not high enough because they value their own flight more than the payment. Note that a fixed payment risks too few or too many volunteers, and in the latter case, it does not ensure that the ones who are dumped value the flight least. So everybody should get a tailored payment until they can trim out all the excess passengers. Don't forget, every time you have to think about whether an allocation is Pareto efficient or not, try to see if from that allocation, this is the starting point, from that allocation, how can we make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off? If we can manage to do this one way or another, we have a better allocation, and so the current allocation is not Pareto efficient. If there is no way to make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off, then the current allocation will be Pareto efficient. And this is what we're going to see in the second statement as well. Think about the firm in a natural monopoly. So a monopoly where in particular there are huge fixed costs and decreasing average costs. So those are markets with economies of scale. The average cost of production decreases as the quantity produced increases. In this case, it is then more efficient to have one firm produce all the output of the market, because in this case, the per unit cost will be lower than if two firms are producing lower quantities and are competing with each other. In this case, a natural monopolist would make a loss if it were forced to sell at a price equals to marginal cost. The idea is that when you have economies of scale, the marginal cost is lower than the average cost. Therefore, the allocation where price equals marginal cost and where the firm is forced to produce a positive amount at that price is not Pareto efficient. Couple of things in this allocation. First of all, price equals marginal cost. So this is the price that consumers have to pay for a unit of the good. Second, at that price, we still assume that the firm has to sell a positive amount. So imagine a government that says, I allow you to be a monopolist, but you are going to charge a price equal to marginal cost, and you're going to supply the whole market at that price. Well, since for a natural monopoly, the average cost is above the marginal cost, because each extra unit costs less than the previous ones. So the average cost will be higher than the marginal cost. In this case, it is not viable to produce at a price equal to marginal cost. For a firm to break even, to make at least a profit of 0 or more, the price should be at least equal to the average cost. But if the price is equal to something lower, like here the marginal cost, then the firm will make a loss. And if the monopolist still has to produce a positive quantity at that price, then there will be a loss. But consumers will enjoy a positive consumer surplus, correct? So any allocation that would make the firm better off implies either a zero profit or a positive one. But anyway, it implies that the firm would have to sell the good at a higher price than marginal cost. If the price has to be higher than marginal cost, it means that the price is going to be higher for consumers, and consumers are going to be made worse off. So here, the only way to make one side better off is to make the other side worse off. Either the firm increases its prices, which makes consumers consumers worse off, or to make consumers better off, the price would have to decrease, but that would make the monopolist worse off. So we cannot make any Pareto improvement. So the current allocation is Pareto efficient. The problem is, at that allocation, the firm is making a loss, so the firm will not last long. Remember that in general, it is easier to show that an allocation is not Pareto efficient, because you can look for any other counterexample, any other allocation that makes somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. However, if you have to show that an allocation is Pareto efficient, it is much harder because you have to go through all possible alternatives and check that none of them make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. But here we were able to tell that any allocation that makes somebody better off will mean that somebody else will be made worse off. So the actual current allocation is Pareto efficient. Now, let's consider the effect of a price ceiling on total surpluses. So a price ceiling is same as a price cap. It is a maximum price a firm is able to charge. That price ceiling can be set, for instance, by the government, who maybe wants to limit some monopoly behaviors. Imagine a market in perfect competition, however. That's what we are looking at here, where we have a supply and a demand. Technically, the equilibrium should be at P star Q star. But for some reason, the government has decided to set a price ceiling. Think about, for instance, the supply and demand for housing, for rental housing. Where supply meets demand is P star Q star. That would be the number of basements or apartments being rented, and that would be the equilibrium rent. Imagine the government, for instance, wants to impose a ceiling on rents to protect maybe tenants, to make sure that students have access to some housing and so on. First of all, the government will never charge a ceiling which is higher than P star. Imagine that the ceiling is higher. Well, the ceiling will not have any impact on the market equilibrium because the market equilibrium is lower than the ceiling already. So if the actual equilibrium rent is $500 and the government sets a limit of $700, then nothing's going to change. The equilibrium is already at 500, which is allowed. So price ceiling will be lower than the equilibrium price. The idea is that instead of P star, now producers are going to charge the closest price, which is P max, the threshold. At that price, producers are going to enjoy that little producer surplus. Consumers, however, get to pay a lower price. Because they pay a lower price, there will be a lower quantity being offered because less suppliers will propose their units for renting due to the decrease in the price. So consumers are going to consume rent all of the apartments which are available. They're going to pay a price of P max, so they're going to enjoy a larger surplus than before on the first units of the good. Now, obviously, producers are worse off. They lost some surplus on the way. What about consumers? On one hand, consumers started with this blue triangle that doesn't go lower than P star. Now, with the price ceiling, their surplus has shrunk to the left, but at the same time it has expanded downwards. So, consumers lost this triangle here, but they also gained that big rectangle. So it is not guaranteed that consumers are better off. In this example, it looks like consumers are better off because this triangle here that they lost is smaller than the rectangle they won. But if the price ceiling was closer to P star, then maybe they would prefer P star. They would prefer to enjoy more units at a price of P star. Firms, of course, prefer no regulation. Note as well that the outcome is not Pareto efficient. This will be the deadweight loss. This huge triangle here used to be shared between producers and consumers. Now it is not going to anybody. And in fact, you can see that all these units between Q max and Q star are units that consumers are willing to rent for a higher price than the rent at which producers are willing to rent those units. So all those units between Q max and Q star are units that could be rented by consumers, and that would make both consumers and producers better off. But that would mean that the price would have to be higher than P max, which is not allowed. There is only one price on the market. Here is going to be P max. Because for those units, firms are willing to rent them for a higher price than P max, because it is not allowed, those units will not be rented. And this is why we lose this surplus. So although it might make consumers better off, overall, there is a deadweight loss. So the gain for consumers overall doesn't offset the loss in surplus for producers. Of course, it depends on what the government is trying to achieve. If the government thinks that producers are enjoying too much surplus already and want to favor consumers, then they might impose a price ceiling on rents to make consumers better off. What about a minimum price? Well, a minimum price is going to work the same way, but the other way around. First of all, the government has no incentive to set a minimum price which is below the equilibrium price, because in this case, nothing is going to happen. The equilibrium price will stay the same. The minimum price should be set above P star to have an impact on the market. Now, if the price here is set at P min, then consumers are going to have a lower consumer surplus than before, and they will only consume a quantity equal to Q min. Producers get to sell the good for a higher price than before, so they enjoy a higher surplus on each unit they sell. However, they do not sell as many units as before. So consumers are worse off because they have to pay a higher price than before for the good, so they consume less. Producers can charge that price, which is very nice for them. Although they sell less units, their surplus might increase. Here it looks like they are actually better off because the gain is equal to this red rectangle and the loss is equal to this triangle. The area of the triangle looks lower, smaller than the area of the rectangle here. Note again that there is a deadweight loss. There is a surplus that is not going to either producers nor consumers. This graph is particularly interesting when you think about minimum wages. Instead of Q and P, you could think about Q as being labor, number of hours worked or number of workers, and P as being the wage. The supply would be the labor supply, which is the amount of hours that a consumer is willing to to sell for wage. And the demand here would be labor demand. Coming from firms, it is the amount of hours that firms want to hire an employee for. Labor demand is downward sloping, as in the lower the wage, the more employees a firm wants to have. The labor supply is upward sloping because the higher the wage, the more hours consumers are willing to work for. The equilibrium wage would be P star, Q star. Now imagine that the government decides on a minimum wage. The minimum wage could then be this P min. And what's going to happen in this case is firms will be worse off. Firms in this case will be coming from the demand because they have to pay a higher baseline wage to their employee, higher than before. Consumers, some of them will be better off, some of them will be worse off. The ones which are better off are the ones who keep their job. Now, each of their hours suddenly increases. It's like their compensation increases. The problem is you can see that Q min is lower than Q star. So if you imagine Q as being the amount of hours, you can see that the new equilibrium amount of hours will be lower than before. So some employees might work the same hours, but they might get paid more for it. So that's great. But some other employees might actually get laid off, or they might be asked to work less hours because now the cost of an employee has increased for a firm. And the minimum wage has this duality. On one hand, insiders are better off. The ones who have a job, don't lose their job, are now paid more for every hour. The outsiders are the ones who are going to have a hard time with the minimum wage because now it's going to be harder for them to find a job. Or some of them will become an outsider because they might get laid off, or they might be asked to work less hours. Firms, of course, are suffering from minimum wage because a wage is a cost for the firms. So the net effect is not really obvious. Some of them are better off, some of them are worse off. Now, in the monopoly lecture, I talked about behaving as a monopoly in markets where there are more than one firm. In particular, I was thinking about oligopolies, where there are only a couple of firms on the market. They are competing with each other, but since there are only a couple of them, they do have market power. Their price and their quantities will have an impact on the market equilibrium. So, consider each of these market characteristics and argue whether it is likely to favor collusion or be a threat to it. I indicated some solutions here if you are interested. They are a bunch of characteristics. And here I'm going to name a couple. What if the product is homogeneous, well established, and has not changed for a long time? Well, it is harder to maintain a collusion agreement when the product is subject to rapid innovations. After all, if there is a new product out there, a firm might come with a new innovation next year or a modification of it. If the product is subject to rapid transformations, firms might not have an incentive to cooperate with each other because they're constantly coming up with a more competitive product. It could be more innovative, it could be cheaper, and so on and so forth. A well-established homogeneous good in general will favor collusion because it is a good that is not about to change anytime soon. It is well established, which also means that those goods tend to have a lower elasticity of demand. Goods which are well established tend to have a rather low elasticity of demand. The idea is that they have been sold for a long time. They are in everybody's mind, so they become a standard staple of everyday life. I'm thinking about candy bars, for instance. Candy bars are very, well, first of all, they are homogeneous in the sense that whether I go to the dollar store or to Safeway, a Snickers at Safeway will be the same as a Snickers at the dollar store. Same with a Reese Pieces, same with Hershey's chocolate bar or Crunch chocolate bar, and so on. So it is easier to maintain collusion for such goods. The dollar store could coordinate with Safeway so that both stores are selling those candy bars for $1.25, for instance. If the project is heterogeneous, if the product is heterogeneous in the sense that each firm is selling a different one, even if they are substitutes, maintaining collusion might be harder because firms might want to sell their own good. If it's subject to rapid innovations, then each new product, each new version of the product will be different from the previous ones, and this is one way firms might use to increase their profits. What about few or no close substitutes? I mentioned in the class that a firm is in a monopoly if there are no other firms on the market or there is no product which is a close substitute to what that firm produces. What if there are few or almost no close substitutes? Well, if there are no substitutes, the willingness to pay for the good by consumers will be higher than if there are substitutes. So, imagine a good that doesn't have many substitutes. What can I think of? Something which is very, very particular. It's a product that is used for a specific purpose, but there is no other good that can fulfill the same purpose. You can probably think of many examples like that. Maybe baking soda, I don't know. The idea is that if there are no good which is close to that good in terms of use, then people need to buy that specific good. So there's going to be a lower elasticity of demand for that good. Moreover, if there are no substitutes, it gives less incentives to firms to deviate from the collusion agreement. Firms might want to maybe pretend they are going to follow the agreement and then take another route, betray their partners. If there are other substitutes, that would be a particular case where that firm can say, yes, I agree with you, I'm going to charge this price, and then decide to produce the other substitute for maybe a lower price and make more profits. Think about Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola. Those two goods are very close substitutes. Chances are that Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola are not cooperating with each other, but rather they are competing with each other. Both goods have a particular demand. Some people only swear by Pepsi-Cola. Some people only swear by Coca-Cola. But if the price of one of the goods is too high, many consumers will just go to the other good. So chances are that Pepsi-Cola could say, yes, I agree, I'm going to charge those prices. After all, our goods are pretty much the same. But then the next day, Pepsi-Cola might betray Coca-Cola by charging a lower price on its bottles. This way, even though there will be a fixed proportion of people buying Coca-Cola, the fans, the aficionados, a bunch of other people might switch to Pepsi-Cola because now it is cheaper. What about if there are few firms on the market? So I talked about an oligopoly. Imagine an oligopoly with 3, 4, maybe 5 firms, but not more. Collusion, remember, is coordination and cooperation between firms. So it is easier for collusion agreements to stick, to maintain, or to reach if there are only a few firms on the market, because there are only so many entities that need to agree to the agreement. Not only agreeing is easier because you only have a couple of firms that you need to agree to, but also detecting cheating and betrayals is easier. If there are 20 firms on the market, first of all, it might be hard to coordinate a collusion agreement with all of them. And second, it might be hard to constantly check which one is following the agreements and which one is not. If there are only 4 firms, monitoring them is less costly. So, easier to reach an agreement and easier to detect cheating. Remember that with cheating can come punishment. If a firm is caught cheating, the other firms can punish that firm by adopting some sort of predatory behavior or by adopting any other form of sanction. So few firms on the market means that collusion is easier to sustain. So governments and antitrust and competition authorities pay a closer attention to firms with only a couple of firms. What if firms have or experience different costs? If firms have different costs, it means that one firm at least is going to be more efficient than another firm. So it is harder for firms to coordinate on a price. They might all decide on a monopoly price, sure, but then a more efficient firm might just propose a price which is maybe $1 cheaper or maybe 50 cents cheaper, get way more of the demand, and since that firm's costs are low, this firm will make more profit. Firms which are efficient, which have low costs, can adopt a predatory behavior. They can charge low prices temporarily to drive the competitors out of the market so that it ends up being in a monopoly. If firms have the same costs, then they will make the same profits if they charge the same price. So it is easier to coordinate on a price. Finally, potential entry to the market. This is one of the conditions of perfect competition, that there are no barriers to entry or exit to a market or from a market. So if new firms can enter the market easily, they might behave competitively and threaten the collusion agreement in place by the incumbents, the well-established firms. If firms are making positive profits in an industry, other firms from outside the industry might decide to enter the market to get a share of the pie. But if entry is easy, chances are many firms are going to enter the market. There will be more competition. There are going to be more firms. So it's going to be harder to maintain or to decide on an agreement. So, potential entry to the market means potential increase in competition. So this will threaten collusion agreements. So, let's sum up. We saw in the first lecture that the market equilibrium is Pareto efficient as long as we have perfect competition, no externalities, and no public goods. Perfect competition includes 5 different conditions. Firms and consumers have no market power because they're too small to influence the market. Information is perfect in the sense that it is available for free and instantaneously and for everybody. The product is homogeneous, so the only way for a firm to sell more than another firm would be through a lower price. No entry or exit to or from the market. No barriers, to entry or exit from the market, so that firms can come and go as they please if they see that profits are good or not. And finally, inputs are perfectly mobile, in the sense that if a firm needs to increase its production scale, hire more employees, and maybe invest in some equipment, then it can do so in a relatively easy fashion. In this case, the market equilibrium outcome is Pareto efficient, in the sense that there is no other allocation, no other outcome that can make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. Total surplus is also maximized. There is no money left on the table. Now, we then went into monopolies. Monopolies correspond to the case where the first condition of perfect competition is violated. The case where firms have no market powers. Here, in a monopoly, the firm is the only producer of the good. So, it has market power. We saw in class that this market power is limited by the price elasticity of demand. The more elastic the demand, the less market power the monopolist has, because it cannot charge a very high price above the marginal cost. If the demand is more inelastic, then it will not react a lot to an increase in the price. So, the monopolist in this case can afford to charge a price way higher than the marginal cost and increase its profits. I mentioned that the market equilibrium is Pareto efficient. This also means that any form of regulation in this case will lead to some inefficiencies. And this is what we saw with a price ceiling and a price floor or a minimum price. We saw that regardless of the policy, there will be a deadweight loss, there will be a surplus that used to be shared between producers and consumers, but is not shared by anyone anymore. Although sometimes consumers, sometimes producers might be better off from this regulation, overall, total surplus is not maximized, and we can find an allocation that makes consumers better off without making firms worse off. Regulation exists, however, because governments are not only interested in efficiency, they also care about equity. I talked about minimum wages, for instance. Minimum wages were used to ensure that workers can get a relatively high or a minimum standard of living. Finally, I talked about most markets we see in real life, which are oligopolies. There are only a couple of firms on the market. Because they're big, they do have some market power, but at the same time they compete with other firms. Sometimes those firms have incentives to cooperate and behave like a monopolist. This is what we call collusion. Depending on the characteristics of the market, collusion might be easier or harder to operate and maintain. If the product is homogeneous and well established, then firms will have no trouble to collude. They know the product, they know its cost, it doesn't change for years and will not change for the future years, so it is easier for firms to make an agreement. If on the other hand the good is not homogeneous and is subject to rapid transformations, then firms always have an incentive to step up their game and produce and propose an updated version of the good. That would increase competition. If there are only few or no close substitutes to the good, then it is also easier for firms to maintain a collusion agreement, because firms have less incentives to cheat on the agreement by producing a rival product. If there are only few firms on the market, it is easier not only to coordinate, but also to detect cheating and betrayal. So, in general, collusion is easier in markets with a small number of firms. If those firms have different costs, however, it might be harder for them to coordinate on a single price, and more efficient firms might want to propose very low prices, just the time for those less efficient firms to leave the market because they don't make any profits anymore. Finally, I talked about potential entry to the market. If there are no barriers to entry, then firms can come and they can go if there are no barriers to exit as they please. If they see that there are some profits being made, they're going to get in. If they're not making any profits anymore, they might switch to another industry. The fact that firms can come and go as they please will make collusion agreements harder, first of all, to make and operate, because there is more movement of firms, and this will also increase competition, making collusion more difficult. That's it for this first tutorial. I'll see you guys in the next about price discrimination. Have a good rest of your week and see you in the next one. Bye.